Someday, the high and the mighty will fall. There will be no power brokers, the wall of power will fall. Someday, the high and the mighty will fall. There will be no power brokers, the wall of power will fall. In the time before the fire, in the time before the wheat, strong man would walk the earth, keep the weak man beneath his feet.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. You are listening to the Wall of Power Radio Hour. This is your host, Paul Metsa. I have a big show 2 weeks from tonight at the Women's Club. We are celebrating the release of my book, Alphabet Jazz, Poetry, Prose, Stories, and Songs. It will be an evening of conversation with author and radio host Andrea Swenson. My two musical compadres, Mary Harris and Sonny Earl, will also join me for a set of original music. Last month, I did a great interview at WTIP Radio up in Grand Marais, Minnesota, with a DJ by the name of Will Moore. We talked quite a bit about the book and this and that. We are going to replay that courtesy of WTIP. So here you go.
It's Paul Metsa, Iron Rage singer and songwriter for many decades and a friend of the station for a long time. And he has a new book out here called Alphabet Jazz, Poetry, Prose, Stories, and Songs. And it has a companion CD as well with a lot of his music over the years, some live ones on there. And he's here to talk to us about it today. So welcome, Paul, for first time live here on the Scenic Crew. Thank you.
Thanks for having me. I'm a big fan of WTIP. I stream your station with great regularity.
That's what we like to hear. And you're going to become a part of the programming. We'll get to that at the end of this interview. But first, I want to talk about this book and this CD. And it sounds like you've written a book before. I saw you had one in like 2011.
Yeah,
came out.
It was called Blue Guitar Highway. It was my autobiography published by the University of Minnesota Press, which was, there was a certain satisfaction there because when I moved to Minneapolis in 1978, I'd been playing guitar pretty much my whole life, and I was taking classical guitar lessons from Robert Wander at UMD, who come to find out is the father of the great writer and rapper Dessa Darling.
Oh, no way. Yeah.
And it's a weird coincidence. So I went to do an audition for the U of M music program, and I passed my playing exam with flying colors. And I remember the very first question on the theory exam was, what is a Neapolitan chord? And I said, I'm screwed.
Something to do with chocolate and strawberry, right?
Exactly. And vanilla. And so anyway, I got a letter back, which I wish I would have still had, that said, upon reviewing your test scores, we highly recommend you find another field of study. So it was with great satisfaction when 30 years later they called me and said, would you be interested in writing your autobiography about your 30 years in the music business?
Yes, vengeance.
They're actually going to re-release it this spring in paperback. I have another book coming out called Blood in the Tracks, the Minnesota musicians behind Dylan's masterpiece, that I co-wrote with a guy named Rick Shevchik, which is all about the Blood in the Tracks sessions, and then all about those 6 Minnesota musicians, their lives before, during, and after. So they will be re-releasing Blue Guitar Highway with that.
Okay.
But this book is Alphabet Jazz. I'm very excited that you're having me up here to talk about.
Yeah, so that kind of answered my question, which was, so that was an autobiography, while this one is kind of telling stories about so many of your friends and family who've been part of your life over the years, a lot of whom have passed on.
Yeah.
So what kind of was the impetus of making this book happen? When did you know, like, I should make a compilation of things like this?
I was decided to move out of Minneapolis, where I lived for 40 years, in the end of 2020. And so I'm going through, putting everything together. And, I'd like to refer to myself as a collector. Ex-girlfriends refer to me as a pack rat. And so I had song lyrics and poems and phrases and titles written on, back of electric bills and on envelopes and on airline sickness bags when I was flying. And so I put everything together, and I actually had, 2 big boxes of stuff. So as I was going through it, I go, you know what? I think there's a compilation here. And because I've always written in a variety of styles, the whole title of the book is Alphabet Jazz, Poetry, Prose, Stories, and Songs. So I thought this would be a good way to collect a lot of these stories and really document my 40 years in Minneapolis. I say in the preface of the book that it's really kind of, in a way, it's Valentine to the city of Minneapolis, where I found friendship and inspiration in every part of town.
Yeah, because you're from the Iron Range up on Virginia, and then
Virginia, Minnesota, the Queen City of the Iron Range.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a beautiful spot. It really is. And so this goes through a lot of different musicians that you met down there. And yeah, if you read the book, it's interspersed with short stories and memories, but also not just poetry and letters, but songs. So tell me about the song component of this and why you wanted to have that in addition to all those remnants and stuff.
I always like, when I write a song, I like it to look good on paper. So it kind of resembles poetry. Whether it is or not is not for me to decide. So in a way, Will, the beautiful thing about using songs in there, I thought, how am I going to put this together? What sort of chronology can I use to kind of bookend all the different styles of writing? And I thought the songs is probably the best way to do that. So the first song in the book is Paper Tigers, which was the title track of my first record, which was put out in 1984, for God's sakes. It's a 40-year anniversary coming up next year. It's hard to believe where the time went. So I took a lot of my songs and spread those out, so there's a chronology there. But then also I hooked up the songs to some of the stories I wrote. For example, my song Robots on Death Row, I put that right next to the piece I wrote about the great bluesman Willie Murphy, who played on the song Robots on Death Row on my first record, Paper Tigers. So I thought there was a connection there, at least in my mind, kind of spiritually, a connection between the song and the musician. So it's not anything, you might have to look for breadcrumbs to figure it all out, or if we're having martinis at the bar, I could explain the rest to you. But there's a certain thread that kind of connects them all.
Yeah, absolutely. And is the intention like people kind of pause the book and listen to these songs that they've got along with it as they're reading?
They can do that, or they can just, they're companion pieces. But a lot of people are enjoying just reading the lyrics to the song. It's funny. I was telling a friend of mine this story. My song Jack Ruby that I debuted actually at 1992 at Farm Aid 5 in Dallas, Texas, in front of 20,000 unsuspecting Texans, 5 miles from Dealey Plaza, where the tragic JFK assassination took place. I put the lyrics in there years ago after I put the record out. It's called Whistling Past the Graveyard. Yeah. I got a call at about 3 o'clock in the morning. I always used to pride myself on having my phone number in the phone book because, I'm a man of the people. Get a hold of me for whatever you need. And there's 2 drunken yahoos called me at about 3:30 in the morning. And I had just gotten to bed after a gig, of course. He said, Metsa. I go, yeah. Do you know how many times you said Jack Ruby in your song, Jack Ruby? I go, no. They go, 46. So, that's, that's a couple of guys with way too much time on their hands. Oh, man. But I haven't actually counted since I have the lyrics of the book how many times I did mention the name Jack Ruby. But it's a good way, I think, into the songs where you don't have to necessarily, I believe that they stand poetically on their own, and you don't have to get necessarily clouded by melodies and guitars and piano and singing.
And you mentioned Willie Murphy just now, and there's a lot of musicians of his caliber, real classic, now legendary Minneapolis musicians. Spider John Kerner comes up in the book. Can you kind of talk about what that was like around that music scene in that era?
Oh, incredible. When I moved to Minneapolis in 78, I've been down to Minneapolis several times. And Willie Murphy, Willie and the Bees, Kerner and Glover, my good buddy Dave Ray and Spider John, they'd play as a trio and occasionally as solos up in Duluth. So if they played at UMD or any of the clubs, I drive down from the range to see them. And I had several of their records. So when I finally moved to Minneapolis in 1978, I lived in South Minneapolis, about 6 blocks away from Orfolk Jokopus, which was kind of the wellspring from where the whole punk rock scene came out of Minneapolis. They were, you could go hang out at Orfolk and buy records and bump into Bob Mould from Husker Du, who became a good friend of mine, and Dave Perner from Loud Fast Reels became Soul Asylum. Tommy Stinson from The Replacements would be there at 13 years old, skipping school. So I got real hip to the all the punk rock thing was going on and all that energy, which I loved. In fact, Bob Stinson, who was a good guitar store and record store buddy of mine, we'd always bump into each other, shopping for guitars or shopping for records, said, all the great Minneapolis rock and roll bands were between Lake Street and Franklin and Hennepin and Lindale. And he was right. And I lived right there. So I got that. But then when I would go to the West Bank and started to play on the West Bank with my band Cats and the Stars, 7 nights a week you could go hear Willie Murphy, Spider John Kerner, Dave Ray, Ipso Facto, Bill Hinckley and Judy Larson. I got a piece on Bill Hinckley in the book. It was like, for me, it was like being a kid in a candy store. Then you had the artist corner on 26th and Nicollet, so you could see Joe Pass and Tal Farlow and Jay McShann and all these great jazz cats. And then Orchestra Hall, where I saw Bill Monroe and Andre Segovia. I mean, I was out, before I started playing 5, 6, 7 nights a week, I was out singing music 6 or 7 nights a week. And these people were not, they were gods to me, and they still are. So part of the book, I've got a piece on, my good friend Willie Walker, who I played for, weekly for 10 years with. We did 500 shows together. Willie Murphy, who became a very good friend of mine. The night John Kerner and I spent in a hotel room with Guy Clark and Townes Van Zandt.
That was a good story.
Oh, harrowing night. Kerner still talks about it. So it was a way to, I also have a piece of, my father, my first rescue dog, Blackie. It was a way for me to keep these people and these stories alive. And it's, I just loved them all that much.
Right. And something else that I really appreciate about this is, you're telling stories about these well-known people, like, even Townes Van Zandt and stuff. But there's a couple other stories in here where you're talking about, like, this woman who was like a booking agent for you, or
Sue McLean.
Yeah. And it's like, these are people whose stories are often unsung, or people don't even know about them. So it's cool that you're, telling their story.
Well, Sue McLean, in fact, I'm doing a big show at the Women's Club on March 25th in Minneapolis, produced by Sue McLean and Associates. Sue McLean was one of the most powerful independent rock promoters in the country. She got started in 1974. She booked her first gig. She booked the Suicide Commandos at a prom for some western suburb, probably Minnetonka or Wayzata in Minneapolis, and went on to be one of the greatest promoters in the history of Minnesota. They booked for years the Minnesota Zoo. She booked the Guthrie Theater. She booked me there 7 or 8 times. She, like I say in the book, she did more for my music career than just about anybody. We became very close friends. And Sue McLean and Associates, run now by her niece Patricia and Kimberly Gottschalk, who is her right-hand lady, are still very much involved producing shows. And everybody in their operation is all women. It's a very women-run operation, but she is respected. That SMA is respected around the country as one of the greatest independent music promoters there is. Yeah. And she was such a sweetheart, too.
Yeah, that's so cool, is like getting those kind of stories, or like, I know I'm trying to remember the guy. It's like real early in the book, and he was like a paraplegic, and
that Larry Keegan.
Yeah, this guy.
Larry Keegan was a very good friend of mine. I used to call him my rabbi. I'm a lapsed Methodist. He was an Orthodox Jew. He was childhood friends of Bob Dylan, and they met at a Jewish youth camp in, I think it was Webster, Wisconsin, and became good friends. And when Bob used to come down from Hibbing, he'd go down and hang out with Larry, and they had they actually went into a record store on Christmas Eve, and Jews don't celebrate Christmas, and so they went into a record store and they did a 7-song demo on an acetate, which Larry played for me. He had it on cassette, and it was 7 songs. It was like Blue Moon and Jenny Jenny, and it was Bob playing piano and Larry and another friend singing, and it was the sound of just unbridled and pure joy. Larry got in a diving accident when he was 19 in Florida, lost the use of his legs, and then 10 years later, he got a car accident in Mexico and became a quadriplegic. He and Bob stayed friends throughout Larry's life. Larry passed away at the age of 60 on, of all days, 9/11, after going to pick up Bob's new record that came out on that day called Love and Theft. But Larry became a very good friend of mine. And I talk a little bit about his friendship with Dylan, but I talked about what an amazing human being he was. And though he was a quadriplegic, you would never know from hanging out with him. I mean, he just seemed like he was like this amazingly spiritual character. And you just expected him to get out of that wheelchair at any point during your conversation and start dancing. So his story was so inspiring, and was such a sweet cat. It was one of the people in my life that I was just honored to know.
This is Paul Metsa joining me here on W.
Stay tuned for more of Paul Metsa's interview on the Wall of Power Radio Hour.
You can't be brave if you are not scared. Well, the day is dark, but the night is darker. The honeybee stays in its hive. Well, the whippoorwill will sing tomorrow for those who ever got out alive. Well, the river runs from golden mountains. A redwood sways from side to side. Bluebonnets grow on Texas prairies, on highways traveled for those who got out alive. Abandoned hope, you must be kidding. My coat of steel, which I wear, put this down upon my tombstone. You can't be brave if you're not scared. You can't be brave if you're not scared.
Wall of Power Radio Hour.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. You are listening to the Wall of Power Radio Hour. This is your host, Paul Metsa. Last month, I did a great interview at WTIP Radio up in Grand Marais, Minnesota, with a DJ by the name of Will Moore. We talked quite a bit about the book and this and that. We are going to replay that courtesy of WTIP. So here you go.
Talking about his book, Alphabet Jazz, Poetry, Prose, Stories, and Songs, filled with stories of remembrance of a number of characters throughout his own musical career and life, and the Minneapolis music scene, and lots of songs and poetry mixed in between. And what I liked about this book, I guess, after finishing it, was I realized, there's a lot of stories in here about meaningful people who have passed away, and that's kind of the end of every story, but it never feels sad. It feels celebratory and jubilant, which I think is a good way to go about it.
Well, all those people brought so much to my life. When I remember them, all I remember is the good times. Memory is funny like that. That's kind of how memory works, right? Mm-hmm. And so I wanted to share the stories of these people with other people, because there's lessons with all of those people that I wrote about in the book. And it was a great way for me, like when I wrote about the last Thanksgiving with my dad, who passed away, 4 months after that. It was a great way to share these stories and for people to enjoy their lives in a way secondhand. The people that, like Willie Walker's wife, Judy, and Larry Keegan's the love of his life, Carol Kruger, they've really enjoyed reading the book about their loved ones. So that's been a really fun role to play, to be able for them to go back and kind of relive their lives with these people as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Like, even if you are not, hip to what was going on in the music scene at that time, it's like these stories about your family and your dog, especially. Like, those are, those are just things that I think would touch a lot of people regardless.
Well, this is probably one of the few books that came out last year that actually has several pieces written by dogs.
By dogs.
By dogs, yes. Not about dogs, although it's kind of about the dogs too. My first rescue, Blackie, who I rescued at Contented Critters in northern Minnesota, who came in from a kill shelter in Thief River Falls, came into Contented Critters, which is no kill shelter, got adopted immediately by this young farm couple. Blackie was with them for about a week, chewed through his leash, and spent all 4 seasons by himself in northern Minnesota. He became a legend. By the time they finally, a woman tricked him into coming in her barn to feed him, and they finally got him to Contented Critters. But he literally spent all 4 seasons in northern Minnesota. And for those of us in northern Minnesota, you can only imagine what a little 32-pound dog, what they've got to go through to survive. I mean, they were seeing, there was Blackie stories. Yeah, I saw him in the garbage can. Yeah, I see he was sleeping in my truck. Yeah, I saw him in the barn. So I spent 16 years with him, and we really developed. Anybody that has a dog, Will, you said your girlfriend just got one. Anybody that has a dog knows that you have this psychic relationship with them. And so I was able to, Blackie wrote a long piece about how I adopted him and our lives together. But I was also, it was such a major part of my life that I wanted to share his story. And he turns out he's a pretty damn good writer as well. Yeah. Why don't I read Blue, my current? He wrote a poem at the very end, and, he's a little full of himself, so he named it after himself, Blue.
So this is, to clarify, this is your new dog, Blue, and this is a poem that he wrote.
He wrote this poem, called it Blue. I mean, of course, he wrote it. He can call it whatever he wants. I adopted him. I was after Blackie died. When we put Blackie down, I tell that story in the book, and that part of it's called Blackie and Paul, a Dog and His Man. I was literally, when I was writing that, I was literally wiping away tears with one hand and typing with the other. And so, and anybody who's had a dog knows what I'm talking about. When you lose a dog or have to let your dog go, and you never want to keep your dog in pain for any longer than they have to be. You don't want to extend a dog's life for your own satisfaction. So when I had to have the vet come over to the house to give Blackie up to the Rainbow Bridge, everybody goes, you got to get a new dog, I said, no, the dog will find me. Well, sure enough, that fall, I lived I owned an old duplex in northeast Minneapolis, and I had some cracks in the foundation. So about every other year, I'd get mice and sneak in through the kitchen. So I thought, well, maybe I'll get a cat. So I do a lot of, over the years, I've done a lot of benefits for different dog rescue operations and humane shelters. And so I went to Homeward Bound Dog Rescue that I did a lot of gigs for. And I go, well, let's see what kind of cats they have, because they were having adoption at PetSmart on that Saturday. And I'm looking through and I go, maybe I'll just peek at the dogs. So I looked, and there was this dog with this goofiest smile. His name was Highway. Somebody left him on the side of a highway in Alabama. So I went there the next day. I called my friend Sherry. I said, put a tag on this guy. I've got a good feeling about him. And he was in a little kennel, and I went and I walked him out. He was about 32 pounds, just about the same size as Blackie. And I walked him out to the petting area. And I tell the story, I had to mop the middle aisle at PetSmart because he wasn't going to get up. You know, they trucked him up from Alabama with all these dogs. He's been with these dogs he doesn't know for a month. And so finally, I got up. I was petting him, and I got up, and he jumped up to give me my first hug. And he's got beagle coloring, so he's black, white, and yellow. And I happened to be wearing a leather jacket that was black, white, and yellow, so we matched perfectly. And there was this guy standing next to us outside by the petting part of the pet store. And I said, hey, would you take a picture of us? And he goes, are you Paul Metsa? I go, yeah. He goes, I loved your book, Blue Guitar Highway. So I looked down at the dog. His name was Highway. I go, Blue Guitar Highway. I go, this dog is mine. So I went and I asked Sherry, I go see if they wanted $400 for him, which was more than fair. I mean, they fixed him, and they trucked him up from Alabama. They put him up for a month, and they gave him all his shots. I said, but I needed tires for my truck too. So I said, see if there's a deal here for it. So they came back out and said, because you've done so much good work for us, fundraisers, a lot, which I used to do with Blackie right next to me, says, we're going to gift him to you. So anyway, Blue, his full name is Blue Guitar Highway 61 Metsa. And this is the poem in alphabet jazz, just called Blue. I was left on a highway in Alabama, just 4 paws and me. On a highway ridden by those blind like Helen Keller and those who wrote like Harper Lee. Those who ran like Jesse Owens and like Rosa Parks who sat so silently. Like Zelda who married F. Scott Fitzgerald and Sun Ra louder than cannons on Tripoli. I'm both soft and loud like that. Took but one day for you to see. Hearts collide, then melt like that, as one, that man-dog jubilee. That God, he's a funny God, the universe from A to Z. Who is to ask, who really knows, matters not to you or me.
There we go. That was from Blue, who not only a great poet as a dog, seems to have a knowledge of history and music too, so that's pretty cool.
Everybody he referenced was actually from Alabama.
Oh, there you go. Paul Metsa is my guest right now on the Scenic Route. We're talking about his book, Alphabet Jazz, that has a companion CD along with it, and we'll be hearing songs from that Spanish.
Stay tuned for more of Paul Metsa's interview on the Wall of Power Radio Hour.
You can't be brave if you're not scared. Let's not forget those vanishing footsteps and all those soldiers who fought side to side. We salute them all in midnight moments, especially those who got out alive. hour draws near and the clock is ticking. I hope the answer comes from 9 to 5. I say a prayer to those still listening, and for those who got out alive.
Wall of Power, Radio Hour.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. You are listening to the Wall of Power Radio Hour. This is your host, Paul Metsa. Last month, I did a great interview at WTIP Radio up in Grand Marais, Minnesota, with a DJ by the name of Will Moore. We talked quite a bit about the book and this and that. We are going to replay that courtesy of WTIP. So here you go.
Paul Metsa is my guest right now on the Scenic Route. We're talking about his book, Alphabet Jazz, that has a companion CD along with it. And we'll be hearing songs from that spanning his career. I want to get back to one more story from the book I was curious about, but just to break things up, I was going to ask, what have you been doing musically lately? Have you been playing gigs or writing new songs?
No, actually, I'm recovering from, I had a foot injury, and I've spent the last 4 months doing hyperbaric oxygen therapy 2 hours a day at the St. Luke's, and to help heal the wound. And I'm on the, I'm back. I'm not on the running track, but I'm back on track. So actually, I'm doing my first gig in several months. If anybody's down in Duluth at the Blackwater Lounge tomorrow night from 8 to 11. But yeah, I'm looking forward to playing some more and doing some book reading gigs. In fact, if there's anybody out there, I'd love to come up to Grand Marais and do a show somewhere in conjunction with one of your humane shelters up here. Sell some books and raise some money and have a few cocktails. So if anybody's out there, get a hold of Will here at the station. He can get a hold of me, and love to come up and do something up here and raise some money for the doggies.
Yeah, we'll figure it out somehow for the dogs. Well, speaking of doing book readings, your writing style, I'm trying to find, what's the blurb on the back here? Metsa is a beat-influenced motor mouth, says Britt Robson of City Pages. Is there a writing style that you think you have, or something that inspired you? Because it is kind of like some of these stories kind of do read like beat poetry. I don't know.
Oh yeah, well, I'm a huge, my generation, man. I'm a huge Jack Kerouac, Gregory Corso, Allen Ginsberg guy. Have been since I was in high school. And in fact, the Kelly Hotchkiss, the man I dedicate the book to, we went to high school together. He was a year older than me, and that's what we used to do, is we would just trade books and songs and poetry, a lot of guys traded baseball cards. And so he was, that's kind of we read a lot. I had a really good English teacher in high school named Tom Moeller, who actually took classes from a guy named B.J. Rolfson, who was a legendary English and humanities teacher from Hibbing High School, who Bob Dylan told personally that he was his greatest influence. And Tom was a student of BJ's, so I feel like I got a little bit of BJ's magic secondhand through Tom. But I've always read a lot. I'm reading 5 or 6 books right now. What was really fun for me to do this book, and why I call it Alphabet Jazz, it's my style of writing. My writing in a variety of styles. I have prose, some straight prose, some more kind of beatnik-edged, flow of consciousness, song lyrics, and then some poems which are some are stream of consciousness and some more just kind of, in a way, iambic pentameter. So it's kind of that's why I call it Alphabet Jazz. It's a little bit of everything.
Gotcha. Yeah. And I'm glad you brought up the Bob Dylan teacher, because the last story I wanted to ask you about was this Dave Morton guy.
Yeah. Who
was like your neighbor to your dad, and he knew Bob Dylan growing up. And tell me about this dude.
Morton was an incredible guy. If you, for those Dylan fans out there that read what I think is the best Dylan biography, No Direction Home by Robert Shelton. Robert Shelton was also the guy that wrote the great review of Bob Dylan, that in 1961 for the New York Times that John Hammond, the great Columbia record producer, got hip to Bob through that, and then through Carolyn Hester's recording session where he discovered Bob playing harmonica. In the first several pages of the book, it talks about how Bob Dylan, when he moved to Dinkytown from Hibbing and started hanging out in the whole Dinkytown beatnik and folk and blues scene with a guy named Diamond Dave Whitaker, who turned Bob on to Woody Guthrie and Dave Morton. In the beginning of the No Direction Home, Shelton describes Dave Morton as when the student is ready, the teacher will appear. And it's about Dave Morton's influence on Bob Dylan, turning him on to Eastern religion, probably whatever sort of, dope they were smoking back then, and poetry and folk and blues. In fact, according to Dave Morton, who I met on a construction site in 1976, told me that he had heard Bob when he started to play all this folk and blues when he moved down to Dinkytown and was associated with Kerner Ray and Glover and all the rest down there. He told Dylan one day, whose name's still named Robert Zimmerman, he said, I like your folk and blues, but you should consider writing your own songs. Well, Morton, turns out, I met him on a construction site on a cement pour. His farm in Angora, Minnesota was only a mile from the original Metsa homestead, and he used to caretake my Aunt Lil, who was still living there. It was in the Metsa family for years, that place. And but Morton also had a jug band called the Juke Savages and performed at the Electric Kool-Aid Acid Test with Ken Kesey. He's actually in the Tom Wolfe book, The Electric Kool-Aid Acid Test, and it's also in the Rolling Stone book of the 500 most influential bands in American history. Was his band, the Juke Savages. He was also one of the guys in 1961 went down to, or was it 63, went down to Mississippi as part of the Freedom Riders. They took a bus down or two from Minneapolis with Marv Davidoff, who he suggested come down. Marv started the Honeywell Project, lifelong anti-war resistor. So Dave played a real part in the whole beatnik and folk and music culture in Dinkytown. Then he moved up to northern Minnesota, and he and I played together quite a bit and got to be really good friends. And so his influence is still being felt in the Minneapolis area, Dinkytown area, and certainly up on the Iron Range. He was just a really larger-than-life human being.
Yeah. Being the guy to recommend that Dylan write his own material is an unbelievable claim to fame that is probably unnoticed by many.
Yeah, and then, like I say in the book, then he ended up living in the same senior home that my dad did. So I talked about my dad, who came from the, my dad was born in 28. Dave was born about 10 years later, maybe 12 or 13 years later. Dave, I think, was born in 40 or 41. But so Dad grew up in the World War II generation, and Dave grew up in, when the 50s were breaking out and to become, flowering into what became the 60s. So really two generations that were really at one point in history at loggerheads, really spending their twilight years together, really looking out for one another. Dave would always make sure my dad made it home from the casino safe and sound. And when my dad, who ate like a sparrow, always had more food to eat, he'd always take it up to Dave to let Dave finish his meals.
Man, that's amazing.
That's America. That, to me, is America. When you can have people from different generations, both patriots in their own way, in the case of these two guys from their separate generations, but coming together at the end, enjoying their families and their work and their station in life, and in Dave's case, his art as well.
That's just one of the stories you can find in this book from Paul Metsa, who's joining me here today, Alphabet Jazz. And to kind of wrap up here, Paul, want to let people know that they're hearing your voice on the air right now, and they're going to hear more of it with an upcoming series that you're going to be doing on this station, it sounds like. Yeah,
I've been talking to the great Annie Passos about I've got a radio show in Minneapolis called the Wall of Power Radio Hour on AM 950 for 8 years. People can stream that. I also have a TV show called Wall of Power TV. But I've always wanted to do, when I started my radio show, I wanted to have a segment called The Senior Moment. Interviews with people over 60 with something to say and a story to tell. And truthfully, there's so many beautiful stories out there. And I've had a lot of great people on my radio show over 60 into their 70s, 80s. And so we're going to work on a show, and we're going to debut it here probably, I think we're talking March, here on WTIP. And I'm very excited about that. And then, too, if people want to get the book, they can order it on Amazon. And hopefully we'll see if we can get it to the bookstore here in Grand Marais as well. I actually did my Blue Guitar Highway. We did a book release there. And if you're in Duluth, you can get it at Zenith Bookstore on the West End as well.
Yeah, right next to Wusso's. It's a good spot. Well, cool. Thanks so much, Paul, for being in and telling us all about this. Is there anything else you want people to know?
No, just I'm really excited to be living in Duluth. The first year I rented the first floor of Bob Dylan's childhood home where I finished both books. So that was very inspiring. Now it's just when I moved back up here to northern Minnesota, I thought, it's going to be all about reinvention and rediscovery. And really what I discovered, Will, is what I'm discovering is just who I used to be in the first place. Mm-hmm. So I love it up here. And who doesn't love Lake Superior?
Exactly. That's it. Do you want to maybe read one more passage or poem from the book to kind of send us out?
Sure, I'd love to. How about...
And then we'll play the most recent song on here, You Can't Be Brave If You're Not Scared.
Great. This is called Whispered Note Between Strangers. Even the bell of midnight needs a night off now and then. The moon goes in and out on its own time, keeps it all to himself. I will share, of course, with friends, but sometimes friends are hard to find, and this night might be one of those. With a jug half full of wine in an alley full of nothing, anything or everything is possible. In stillness, time is almost out of reach. Daylight just round the corner. At least, let's hope so. No angles or the jingle-jangle bells of morning. Dawn's all gray and nothing but forgiving. And when it casts its glance to the judge's chair, let's hope to God he is asleep. In sleep and dreams, we all become equal. In sleep and dreams, we become who we are. In beauty, grace, and the rusted sunshine of all promises that were promised to no one, but moon's honest light are welcome to all. I'll take it, throw buffalo nickels to dead-end kids, and lend dollars to pinstripe men and women with kids at home, for even those without them would do the same. For those of us with God and those of us without, at the end of a darkened day can agree to at least feed the hungry mouths and hearts that heard we were near and had something to give, that heard our beating hearts and wanted to dance, that knew we had blood like their own and could always share our liquid heart. Thanks for listening to the Wall of Power Radio Hour. We'd like to thank WTIP Radio and host Will Moore for letting us rerun this interview I did with them last month. This show was produced by John Saristo and Brett Johnson. Once again, my show celebrating the recent Alphabet Jazz Poetry, Prose, Stories, and Songs Saturday, March 25th at the Women's Club in Minneapolis. Advance tickets and VIP packages available at SueMcLean.com. And like my dad used to tell me, remember to be kind and make someone happy.